Good afternoon. Welcome to the Presidential Invited Session featuring Christopher Edley, Jr. My name is Gloria Ladson-Billings. I am the 2006 AERA President. I'm going to take a minute to introduce our featured speaker, and on this panel, or in this session, we also have a respondent, so I will do both introductions now. Christopher Edley, Jr. joined Boalt Hall as Dean and Professor of Law in 2004 after 23 years as a professor at Harvard Law School. He earned a law degree and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard, where he served as an editor and officer of the Harvard Law Review. Edley's academic work is primarily in the areas of civil rights and administrative law. He has also taught federalism, budget policy, Defense Department procurement law, national security law, and environmental law. Edley was co-founder of the Harvard Civil Rights Project, a renowned multidisciplinary research and policy think tank focused on issues of racial justice. His publications include Not All Black and White, Affirmative Action, Race and American Values in Administrative Law, Rethinking Judicial Control of Bureaucracy. Following graduation, Edley joined President Carter's administration as Assistant Director of the White House Domestic Policy Staff, where his responsibilities included welfare reform and Social Security. He served as National Issues Director throughout the 1987-88 Dukakis presidential campaign and as a senior advisor on economic policy for President Bill Clinton's transition team in 1992. From 1999 to 2005, Edley served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. In 2001, he was a member of the Carter-Ford National Commission on Federal Election Reform. He is currently a trustee of the Russell Sage Foundation and the Century Foundation, and a member of the National Academy of Public Administration, Council on Foreign Relations, and the Executive Committee of the Advisory Board of the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education of the National Academies of Science. His own special AERA connection is as director of the Harvard Civil Rights Program. He is responsible for writing the amicus brief which AERA filed in the Michigan cases on affirmative action. Our respondent today is Goodwin Liu. Goodwin Liu is a law professor at Boalt Hall School of Law at UC Berkeley. His primary areas of expertise are constitutional law, education policy, civil rights, and the Supreme Court. He has published widely on these subjects in law reviews and general media. His latest work is Education, Equality, and National Citizenship, an article forthcoming in the Yale Law Journal. With Christopher Edley, he is co-director of a multi-year interdisciplinary project called Rethinking Rodriguez, Education as a Fundamental Right, in the newly launched Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute for Race, Ethnicity, and Diversity. In January, Professor Liu testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee on the nomination of Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court. Professor Liu is a Stanford alumnus, a Rhodes Scholar, and a graduate of Yale Law School. He serves on the board of directors of the ACLU of Northern California, the American Constitution Society in Washington, D.C., and Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco. Let us welcome Professor Edley, and he'll be followed by Professor Liu.
Thank you, Madam President, and thanks to all of you for joining us here this afternoon. I want to use education as an example of the ways in which we should be amending the conceptualization of civil rights. And by civil rights here, I mean racial and ethnic justice, not all the other dimensions of civil and human rights. In thinking about the condition of the struggle for racial and ethnic justice and how it finds itself today, it's helpful, I think, to think about the underlying principles, the foundation elements, if you will, of our modern contemporary civil rights framework. In doing so, I want to focus on three. First, click. Excellent. The first of these is the what we could think of as the anti-discrimination principle. As we understand it from equal protection doctrine, the thing to emphasize here is that the anti-discrimination principle that emerged in the 50s and 60s following Brown versus Board of Education reflected a choice, a very important choice about whether to read into our Constitution a imperative that you might think of as sort of an anti-subordination principle, using the Equal Protection Clause, using the Due Process Clause to make out an argument that there was an imperative to dismantle Jim Crow, to dismantle the legacy of color caste, root and branch. But in the years following Brown versus Board, particularly in reaction to the criticism raised in the academy that Brown versus Board was lacking in principle, what emerged instead of an anti-subordination imperative was an anti-classification principle. This interpretative choice focusing on equality in treatment rather than anti-subordination had powerful effects in the years that followed. The difficulty with the anti-subordination principle, it was thought, is that, geez, do we really want unelected judges trying to tell up from down? That is to say, looking at social circumstances and deciding who was the oppressed, who was the oppressor, who should be favored, who should be disfavored, against the judgments of the political branches. And the conservative reaction to Brown v. Board instead narrowed the imperative to this anti-classification principle, which led to several things. For example, the requirement of a compelling interest in constitutional doctrine to justify classification based on race or ethnicity. A second, the formulation that the remedial predicate that could justify classifying people by race had to be focused on findings of intentional discrimination rather than the mere circumstance of social discrimination or color caste. Societal discrimination alone was not thought by the Supreme Court to be a sufficient justification for violating the anti-classification norm in the 14th Amendment. Still, a third fallout from the choice of this anti-classification principle was opening the door to claims of reverse discrimination, the arguments in favor of colorblindness, and the like. Still, another allied problem was illustrated in the 1973 decision in San Antonio v. Rodriguez, where the Supreme Court refused to treat basic education as a fundamental right for equal protection or due process purposes. Now, I hope we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. I hope that Goodwin is going to elaborate on that. So, pillar number one, foundation block number one, emerging from the 50s and 60s, the anti-discrimination principle. Certainly a wonderful thing, but not all that one might have hoped following Brown versus Board. The second building block is the integration norm, the norm of tolerance. This important pillar, which we now take for granted, and which opinion surveys over time have illustrated, has grown enormously, at least in terms of reported tolerance. This growth of sympathy for the integration ideal has indeed been transformative. For example, according to the Gallup polls, some 80% of people in the 1960s were opposed to interracial marriage, while today only 11% will confess that they are opposed to interracial marriage. This recent figure is so low, in fact, that the president of the Gallup organization has said he doesn't really think it's credible. But at least people recognize that in polite company, the tolerance norm has taken root to such a degree that they must swear by it. However, the evidence on integration in schools, in housing, in social life generally remains quite problematic. The degree of segregation in our society is by many measures in recent years increasing, especially in schools. So with respect to school integration, after the dramatic trend towards desegregation for African Americans peaked in the 1980s, my former colleague Gary Orfield, of course, chronicles this quite regularly and notably, our schools are again becoming increasingly segregated. There's a terrible, consistent record for Latinos in this regard. Latinos who never experienced a school integration movement. So while we have the integration and tolerance ideals, the reality is quite imperfect. The third fundamental block of the modern civil rights consensus is the notion of progressive redistribution and socioeconomic mobility. The vision from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King Jr., including Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, all of these visionaries imagined a dimension of progressive social and economic redistribution and mobility that transcended mere formal legal equality to include, in its mature expressions, commitments to both a socioeconomic safety net and effective mechanisms of opportunity that make upward mobility a realistic possibility both within and across generations. In a sense, this is a post-Enlightenment New World vision that contrasts with the hereditary imprisonment of class, caste, and latter-day feudalism, the caricatures of old-style Europe and many other societies around the planet. I very much want to associate the New Deal and Great Society innovations as social transformations allied with and conjoined with the consensus civil rights vision produced by the end of the 1960s. So, if these three pillars, anti-discrimination, integration and tolerance, redistribution, are the fundamentals established circa 1968, the question is, some 40 years later, are they good enough to get us where we need to go in the next generation? Or put differently, what next? Click. Yeah. The first statement of the problem is somewhat straightforward. We face new circumstances. The demographic realities, I don't need to reiterate all of those. The changes in the legal and judicial climate. While there certainly have been some periods of the past 50 years when the courts were exceedingly helpful, it would be foolhardy to expect much help from the federal courts for the next several years. There's certainly a change in our political culture, with a rising consensus that less government is better, that more individual responsibility is the solution to the ills of the welfare state. These changed circumstances alone suggest to me that the pillars of the current civil rights modus vivendi need renovation. Another way of stating the problem is that we're stalled. First, racial and ethnic justice are just off the agenda, politically irrelevant for most purposes. Take almost any major national policy concern, putting aside undocumented aliens, and the racial justice claims barely have a seat at the table. A few years ago, there was an extensive, elaborate debate about a so-called Patient's Bill of Rights in healthcare. But regarding the issues of racial disparities in access to healthcare or the well-documented evidence of unequal treatment in the provision of healthcare, no one thought to add those to the elements of the proposed Patient's Bill of Rights. Another dimension of this stalling is that we're demobilized, politically demobilized, as a social movement, as a political force, And while not demobilized as a cultural force, I see the risks of marginalization increasing even as the proportions of the population who are racial and ethnic minorities increase. I think of demobilization as one of three critical explanations for the challenges that are facing the classic civil rights consensus. But the second is the dearth of useful intellectual capital on how to pursue racial and ethnic justice in each of the relevant policy domains at the federal, state, and local levels. It's one thing to say that we need K-12 school reform, but another thing to ensure that civil rights advocates, that those who speak for poor and racial minority communities, have sufficient intellectual capital to be able to state what it is they want by way of improvement in K-12 education. This is an intellectual challenge that researchers should play an important role in addressing. But still, a third aspect of why we are in trouble today, why we are stalled, is the ambivalence we have regarding some of the central challenges of racial and ethnic justice. For example, there's the ambivalence around the integration ideal itself. While on the one hand, one of the pillars is the norm of integration and tolerance, on the other hand, minority and non-minority communities alike question the value of integration, question what they're prepared to do to achieve it. Integration remains deeply controversial in practice. There's also ambivalence regarding the struggle, the tension between the position of the underclass and the position of strivers, between the chronically poor and the tentatively emerging middle classes. We're ambivalent about coalition strategies across lines of class and color, with some romanticizing their potential and others cynical about coalition agendas. Now, what I want to emphasize is that all of these strands of ambivalence are, in some respects, instances of the broader problem of the poverty of our discourse surrounding values. The most troubling instance of this is the sapping of strength of the anti-discrimination paradigm itself, the sapping of the moral strength of the anti-discrimination paradigm brought about by ambivalence around coalitions, ambivalence around the role of the public sector versus the private sector, ambivalence around the integration ideal itself. Now let me sum up. Thus far, I've sketched three foundational elements for the modern civil rights consensus: the anti-discrimination paradigm, the tolerance norm, and a mild redistribution ethic. But second, I've argued that with changed circumstances and the evident stalling of the civil rights movement, our present malaise can be attributed to the interrelated effects of political demobilization, a deficit in intellectual capital, and the poverty of our values discourse, with the latter most tellingly reflected in the exhaustion of the anti-discrimination paradigm. I want to suggest three possibilities for the reconceptualization, or perhaps better put, the amendment of the current conceptualization of civil rights. The first is thinking as we go forward about the distinction between an emphasis in advocacy, in rhetoric, in aspiration, in policy design, an emphasis on remediation as opposed to prevention, between acting against the acute manifestation of color caste versus acting to address things of a more systemic or structural nature. Now, to say that we need to focus on prevention and structural change rather than on mere remediation is an excruciatingly obvious point, perhaps, to just about everyone except lawyers. But since lawyers are so important, it's a point worth making nonetheless. An example would be the difference between civil rights litigation or advocacy directed at individual incidents of school discipline being meted out for arguably racially motivated reasons, or the deprivation of hearing rights for kids, versus complementing this focus on acute remedy with systemic strategies that seek to find ways to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline, in which the disciplining of the student is simply the first step in a chain of events leading to the juvenile justice system and ultimately to prison. Another example would be advocating a categorical grant and aid program for bilingual teacher aides versus transforming the politics of school finance. The choice of whether we conceptualize the civil rights challenge in this arena in terms of the acute and remedial, rather than in terms of the structural and preventive, is very important if we're going to make more progress in the coming generation than we have in the generation since Brown v. Board. Now, of course, there's a spectrum. Many measures, perhaps most, will have both remedial and preventive dimensions. The question is the mix and the importance of pressing for the structural, systemic strategy, even though it is often more radical in its aims. A second and broader notion that I suggest in renovating our civil rights framework is the distinction between fault and regulatory engineering. Suppose you have an automobile and it's not working. There's a problem in the way it's designed. One way to approach the problem is to try to pinpoint a negligent actor inside the manufacturer or someplace in the distribution chain who has failed in some duty, and then seek remedial measures targeted at that individual. Another approach would be to say, isn't there a better way to build this vehicle? Let's figure out what that is and re-engineer it. This is the difference between a retrospective question of identifying fault as opposed to a prospective strategy to engineer some corrective measure, almost independent of considering whether there was blameworthiness. It's a move away from the anti-discrimination blameworthiness paradigm towards something that is more regulatory in nature, where one might seize upon disparities or circumstances that are somewhat, for some reason, deemed unacceptable, and engineer the interventions needed to bring about necessary change. That's not to say that one doesn't appeal to ideals of racial and ethnic justice to motivate, to produce the moral and political consensus to adopt the regulatory strategies to re-engineer schools and education, or the healthcare system, or the employment system. It's just that there can be a possibility of decoupling the reform of education, for instance, from the search for a blameworthy perpetrator of injustice. It's a no-fault gap-closing strategy in which the effort is to build a consensus about a vision of an improved society rather than to figure out where's the person with the racial animus dripping from his or her lips that we want to pillory, and then feel good about this fact, feel good about what we did, even if there are countless others who remain oppressed. This regulatory approach to civil rights would be a complement, I want to emphasize this, would be a complement, not a substitute, for anti-discrimination principles and enforcement. Blameworthiness is still vitally important as moral and political instruction, as well as for instrumental reasons of deterrence, remedial or compensatory redistribution, etc. There is a role for both prospective injunctions and retrospective punishment. One would not rely exclusively on one or the other. It's useful to think about a spectrum of actions and ideals that range from the precatory and purely aspirational to the hortatory and then to the regulatory, all the way to the instantly and immediately enforceable entitlement or right. So there's this wide spectrum from just the hot air, the gaseous product of a political process on one end, all the way to what we might think of as the 24-karat 24 gold carat right, whatever that means. Simply suggesting that we augment the fault-based anti-discrimination principle with a regulatory reengineering principle brings us to the further question of where along this continuum we position ourselves, either in constitutional doctrine or statutory law or in practice at a local school board. To say that we abandon focus on wrongfulness, on blameworthiness, on articulating rights in a constitutional sense simply means that we want to use the full spectrum of regulatory tools, of intervention tools, in order to make change. Now, let me try to now elaborate a bit. Let me skip over that. I won't, in this audience, dwell on No Child Left Behind in detail, because if you can't spell NCLB, then you're at the wrong conference. So let me do this. I want to talk for a moment about, in a complementary way, about some of the challenges that are facing us in the education context. And what I'm going to go through here is a series of slides exploring this little matrix, in which I have 4 headlines: Appomattox Redux, Plessy versus Ferguson After All, Bull Connor's Dead, Science versus Hope. And in each of them describe what I take to be a serious problem that is stalling our progress. And then a little bit of a hint about the promise or the possibility of moving in the right direction. By Appomattox Redux, I simply mean this. We have 15,000 or so school boards. We have this tradition of local control. We take one of the most difficult challenges facing the United States in the 21st century, and we turn it over to these 15,000 committees, mostly amateurs. Civic-minded, but amateurs. In domestic matters, and especially in education, states' rights always threatens to trump. But our aspirations for racial and ethnic justice are national in character, and this conflict between the localism of states' rights and the imperative, the national imperative of racial and ethnic justice has frequently been a flashpoint. My contention is that our loyalty to local control of education is an anachronism and is a hindrance to furtherance of civil rights. Put sharply, if we want substantially more progress in the next 50 years than we have had in the last 50 years since Brown, something here's got to give. I think we fought a civil war, and I think I recall who won. Now, what about threats and bribes? Well, I mean, it's true. The basic solution to this states' right problem is the way I deal with my 4-year-old, threats and bribes. But the difficulty there is that Congress and the implementing bureaucracies rarely wield a big stick in fact, and more often as not, of course, a big stick isn't the right tool anyway. Something more surgical would be appropriate. Crafting the right kind of intervention is no easy task, but the political will to do that and to use it is often lacking. I had more arguments than I care to count with Democratic candidates for president in 2004, who, like many Republicans, argued that a major problem with No Child Left Behind is that the resources had not been appropriated by Congress. Well, the objection to that line of thinking from a civil rights perspective is that if state and local governments want the responsibility for educating, they must do so fairly. they must do so with a measure of racial and ethnic justice. And they must do so whether or not they get a check from Washington. Yes, it's an unfunded mandate, but so is the First Amendment. The question is, which mandates are only significant, are only enforceable if accompanied by a check, a bribe, and which mandates are sufficiently important that we simply state them as a condition of doing business. You want the job, here's what it takes in order to do it. Plessy versus Ferguson, after all. Well, we had Brown versus Board of Education, but the reality today, with the increasing segregation in K through 12, is that for too many low-performing students, color and class segregation is the reality. Now, I don't believe that the next 50 years will bring us the progress we want unless we have a strategy to deal with this. And I understand that our president addressed this in her remarks last night. Here the situation is quite muddy, because when I turn to the promise, the fact of the matter is fixing the problem of color and class isolation in schools is difficult given housing patterns and given the jurisdictional problems outside the county systems. So thoroughgoing reform of governance would seem to be a predicate towards really tackling economic and racial segregation. But beyond that, the question is how to transform state and local politics so that segregation by wealth and by race does not produce segregation in resources. And as for that, something like No Child Left Behind, with an insistence on the narrowing of achievement gaps, is a civil rights imperative. With all the problems that NCLB has, it's a step in the right direction. Now, Bull Connor is dead is simply the observation that the powerful symbol of racial and ethnic hatred is gone. Or more subtly, the observation that with the murder of Martin Luther King in 1968, the civil rights movement underwent a process of secularization in which values discourse and the leadership of the clergy seemed to take a back seat to the rise of lawyers and policy wonks, people like, well, like us. And the result of that, as I suggested, is not simply the sapping of the strength of the anti-discrimination paradigm, but the danger that as we discuss the policy plumbing around NCLB or the fine points of equal protection doctrine, we'll be discussing the policy plumbing and the American people will lose interest because what they care about are the values. One response, even for technocrats, is to recognize that we have to augment the moral claim of anti-discrimination with something like no-fault regulatory rights. That we may be able to marshal a consensus to narrow disparities more than we can marshal an effective enforcement regime to identify people who are hateful and prejudiced. Finally, science versus hope. Here I want to pause and do a little bit of a riff about the difficulty here of connecting the world of research to the world of civil rights advocacy, but more specifically, or more generally, I should say, the world of research to the world of policymaking. When No Child Left Behind was being drafted, people on the Hill asked the question, if we're going to have proficiency and we want to set an ambition for moving to proficiency, how long should it take? And they went to some activists who said 2 years. And they went to some researchers who said, well, you know, the effect size when we do these when we do this research, it's awfully disappointing, and we're really not sure what would work. What's a policymaker to do? Well, 12. How about 12 years? Because there are 12 fingers on your hands. No, because there are 12 toes. No, well, 12. Because there are 12 grades if you don't count kindergarten. There's no logic, right? There's no logic. The point is, the hope for rapid progress comes into conflict with the science about how quickly can science be achieved. And the disconnect between the research community and the policy community yawns ever wider. Now, I've been thinking about this. Here's what you do, you researchers. You come up with stuff at the wrong time, the wrong place. So from my position as a policymaker now and then, not now, or you're coming to me with some finding that has no relationship to the policy agenda, so it's like, so what? And then there's the problem that you don't hang out with political hacks. You hang out with each other. So from a policymaker's perspective, you never call, you never write. Now I'm doing the legislation and you expect me to stop and listen to you? Who are you? Right? Still more common, you work on the wrong damn question. Right? I mean, this is very nice research, but thanks for nothing. It's not the thing I'm worried about. Here I am, I'm about to decide in the Supreme Court whether diversity is a compelling interest. What kind of research do you have for me? Answer, oh, we've been doing work on how to get people to have lunch together. Well, doesn't help me, right? But fortunately, on that particular example, we did mobilize research that addressed the question that the court was interested in. But too often than not, there's a misfit between the questions that the researchers want to pursue and the answers that the policymakers need. The most important to me, the most interesting problem, however, is this last one, the science disjunction. This difficulty of communicating across cultures of evidence of cultures of evidence and proof. So let me show off my PowerPoint skills here, which are truly awesome for a lawyer, I might add. So the first thing in thinking ahead to the bottom line here about what can researchers and lawyers do is to just unpack the process a little bit, and this makes it fairly simple. I want to emphasize, however, the intermediaries in the middle, because by and large, the folks on either end of this process aren't good at talking to each other. So the creation of individuals and institutions that can fulfill that intermediating role is quite important. Let's just take one function here, uptake, break it down to the people who are involved in uptake, and this suggests one could imagine strategies for improving the human capital here. One could suggest strategies for improving the processes for dissemination, for diffusion here, and not take it for granted that it happens automatically. I mean, compared to what happens in the biomedical field, in the medical arena, where education researchers and the education industry is like medieval, right? Their strategy for getting research results deployed, they spend a lot of time working at it. We don't. With respect to your core responsibilities, there's a long list of ways in which we could imagine improving science over time. And this is a rich agenda that I would claim, in my imperial way, is also a civil rights agenda. Let me talk about one particular dimension of this. Imagine that you have 3 domains of research evidence, R1, 2, 3. I have a policy problem. I want to reduce racial disparities in graduation rates. It's different from, but not far from, a concern I have about special education referral rates. My question is, can I come to you and get anything useful to make my decision? I want to look at the inferences possible from domains R1, R2, and R3. So you could visualize it this way. Here's some inferences that would seem to be supported by the science from these domains. And you can see that from R3, I got one that's a pretty powerful inference, but it's not really on target. I got another, the blue one, that's just useless. R1 is interesting because there's a pretty strong inference, and it really gets towards the problem I'm interested in, but it doesn't get me all the way. It doesn't get me all the way. There's a gap that has to be closed. And there's going to be a question. You're only comfortable getting me 80% of the way there, but I'm the policymaker, and I'm desperate, and if you don't help me, I'm going to roll the dice, flip a coin, throw a dart, take a bribe. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. Right? R2, there's an inference, but it's still farther away. If I want to draw from R2, I've really got to make something of a leap. So you might look at here the kind of the leaps of faith, leaps of inference coming out from me towards the research community. The yellow one at the top, that probably wouldn't make you too uncomfortable. But the pink one, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where scientists get nervous. They worry about whether the science is being misused. Somebody sitting in R2 might even say, well, I don't really have anything to contribute to your problem. I'm going to embargo my expertise. R3 is interesting because it asks us to figure out how close is problem 1 to problem 2. Can I get help on answering problem 1 from valid inferences made about problem number 2? And then, of course, there's always the act of desperation. I could cite the blue evidence because the vote on the floor is tomorrow. Now, one thing that we must do in thinking about these problems, there they are refreshed, is think about how to construct solutions, intermediating entities, fluid career paths to dismantle the social gulf. Much more attention to multidisciplinary, multi-professional collaboration so that your skills can be married with mine to engineer amendments to No Child Left Behind that will meaningfully reflect the science as well as the politics of the problem. And in particular, the deep challenge of working at a science of decision-making under, I won't say uncertainty, I'll say confusion. Let me skip through what I was going to say here. Bottom line, science versus hope. I think that our dreams can be killed by snake oil. So civil rights needs the science. R&D is a civil rights issue. The way in which you mobilize yourselves to be involved on these issues effectively is critical. Last, let me just talk about some design problems. If we are going to have something in the nature of a right, even a no-fault regulatory right, here's 6 dimensions to its design. The first, public versus private, is a classic one and often causes us to stall. But let me put that to one side. The complexity in thinking about the level, in identifying the measures, in thinking about the accountability systems, all of this, I got to tell you, folks, this is too hard for you. This is too hard for you. And I guarantee you it's too hard for staffers on Capitol Hill. Right? I mean, it's not too hard to do something, but it's too hard to get it right. So what I'm after here is a far more effective partnership between leading researchers and lawyers and others, experts in organizational behavior, the whole range of disciplines and professions needed to tackle the challenge of reshaping the education sector to better pursue racial and ethnic justice. Let me skip over, in the interest of time, skip over these last points and simply simply say this about our roles. I see there as being three critical aspects to the partnership I'm suggesting. One is the construction, self-conscious construction of intermediating institutions. This is what the ambition that Gary and I had with the Harvard Civil Rights Project. It's what we're trying to do with the Chief Justice Warren Institute on Race, Ethnicity, and Diversity at Berkeley, the Warren Institute. And there are other efforts around the country. I think one of the characteristics of an effective intermediating institution will be that researchers get to do world-class research. It's not advocacy research, it's world-class research. But in thinking about the research questions, there is a two-way bridge so that they are informed about the policy agenda that is upcoming. And there is attention to taking the research results and doing the translation, the dissemination, and the policy engineering of institutional nuance to make the products, some form of the products, useful to busy people who just want to take it and run. This is hard work. If you're not an expert at it, don't try to do it. Find a partner to help. But the research papers that have the throwaway 3 paragraphs at the end about policy implications are unlikely to get it right, or at least unlikely to get it sophisticated enough to actually be usable by a busy policymaker. So that's point number one, the intermediating institutions. Point number two is a specific pitch for partnering with lawyers. I don't only mean lawyers in the classic sense of litigators, but I mean lawyers in the sense of folks who will sharpen a pencil and try to write the language that says how you measure high school dropout rates. We'll try to work with you on the language that says, here's what it means to say multiple measures. But third is the caution, and it's the 1968 caution. Both researchers and lawyers must be wary technocrats are not going to win these battles. We are only servants. Ultimately, the hardest choices are going to be choices about values. The hardest choices are going to be made only after there is a discussion of values sufficiently rich to create the moral and political consensus to adopt the measures that technicians craft. What we can do, of course, is provide the information, the data, the insights to inform the debate about values. And that is crucial. So the lesson is actually twofold. It's to have humility with respect to what our leadership responsibility is. It's significant, but not complete. And to recognize that to be truly effective, we have to find a way to not only work with each other, but to work with those who function in the world of values and politics. Let me simply close by saying that education, as I'm sure everybody in this room must feel, what happens with education is probably more than any other issue going to determine what happens with racial and ethnic difference in America in the generation ahead. President Clinton, when he was working on when he was getting started on his race initiative in 1997 and 98, had a meeting with the advisory board chaired by John Hope Franklin to kick it off. And he and the vice president were in the Oval Office with the 8 members of that advisory board, plus me as designated schmoozer. And Clinton pointed to the chair that the vice president was in, and he said, "I've sat in this room with leaders from societies around the world who preside over thousands and thousands of murders each month based on racial, ethnic, tribal, religious difference. And they look to America as a beacon of hope, all that trite stuff. And they marvel at our ability to deal with our diversity. But you know and I know," Clinton said to the group, "that the picture in America is far more complicated, and we have much work that's undone." He went on to talk about how he, as the last president of the 20th century, first president of the 21st century, felt an obligation, a stewardship obligation, to do whatever he could to prepare America for the great challenges of the 21st century. And that number one on his list is how to deal with difference, specifically racial and ethnic difference. He said, if we can get this one right, all the other challenges that America faces we can take care of. This is the hard one. And he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. Many of you have heard me say it. This is not rocket science. This is harder than rocket science. Right? Rocket science is 10 years, put a man on the moon, done. Race is 50 years since Brown? No. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, arguably all of human history. This is hard stuff. So we should make common cause, and we should be ambitious. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. Goodwin?
Well, good afternoon. You know, typically, when you have a conference like this and you have a scholar come up after another scholar, supposedly given response, the format is sort of like, okay, that was interesting. Now, here's what I have to say. Well, it's harder to do that when the speaker is Chris Edley, and it's even harder to do that when he's your dean. So I will be guilty of that a little bit, but I want you to know that I did take notes on his speech, and I'll try to say a few things to sort of amplify and to add my own perspective as to what I took away from it. Let me begin with the points that Chris made about the transition from what I'll call old civil rights to new civil rights. I think Chris sketched very compellingly the conceptual foundations of that shift. The one piece of it that I'd like to emphasize to you is that we are used to thinking about the old civil rights as a civil rights paradigm in which we go to court to assert the right. That, after all, is the fundamental tradition arising from Brown versus the Board of Education. Well, I would argue that the complex architecture that Chris has sketched out with respect to how educational research feeds into public policy making, and if you think about what's happening even in the judicial realm today, there is a lot more to be said for the legislature as the locus of civil rights activity in the foreseeable future as well as today. This is a lesson, I think, that we should have already learned from our history. One thing that seems clear is that if you look at the broad run of American history, and this may be a somewhat arguable proposition, but I think it is defensible if you take pound for pound of work that Congress has done versus what the Supreme Court has done, I think you would have to conclude that most of the most important civil rights victories have been won through the majoritarian institution of Congress and not the minoritarian institution of the court, save Brown versus the Board of Education. In fact, on the long run of history, the court has more often been in the position of the vanguard against civil rights advancement. Think back to the very beginning, Reconstruction, where Congress, in a series of dramatic pieces of legislation, sought to enforce voting rights, sought to enforce civil rights, gave us the precursor to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It did that in 1875. And what happened? Well, a reactionary Supreme Court undid all of those things. Think to the New Deal. Again, there is an instance where the Congress was ahead of the court, and the court was in the business of pulling Congress back. Think to, even after Brown, that the court by itself, after 1954, could not have enforced fully, and it did not, for 10 years, did not lead to a measurable increase in the percentage of black kids who went to majority white schools, even in the most segregated places of the South. Can you imagine that? A court order sitting dormant for 10 years disobeyed until what happened? The Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I think if you look across the broad run of history, you would have to conclude that majoritarian institution, Congress in particular, has emerged as the primary locus of civil rights advancement, civil rights enforcement, which, if you look at today's Congress, may not provide you with a great deal of hope. But I would argue to you that, for example, we have in front of us today a piece of legislation, No Child Left Behind. Lots of imperfections, lots of flaws, lots of problems. But it makes me nervous as a progressive liberal lawyer to hear politicians and advocates talk about states' rights as an argument against No Child Left Behind. It seems to me the better course would be to take lemons, make lemonade. And that is a structural point, right? In order to accomplish the nuance and the architecture that Chris so ably laid out, I think requires the peculiar sorts of institutional advantages that come with working within a legislature rather than litigating cases in the clunky, slow, and deeply imperfect fashion of the courts. Okay? So that is point one. The legislature, I think, ought to be our primary forum that we think of for making policy judgment in the face of empirical uncertainty and, in the long run, for making our most important civil rights ideas stick. Okay. Unlike most Washington types, I only have 2 points, not 3. So on to the second point. Let me see if I can go back to, this is a slide about NAEP scores, but let me see if there's a slide that comes before. I had given an earlier version to the guys backstage. Well, nope. Okay, let's go back to the NAEP score slides, and I will talk our way through it. The second cluster of points I would like to make have simply to do with the intersection between educational research and the questions that Chris left us with, the questions of values. Okay? So you can think of this thematically as the limits of what technology of education can give us and where that comes up against the border of normative values as to what we want our education system to achieve. And my point is simply that even as we, as members of this conference, even as we drill down harder into questions of what makes for good policy, what makes for good educational practice, even as we develop the architecture for how to get that knowledge into a useful form for public policy, we ought not lose sight of the very big questions of normative frameworks and values that are deeply embedded in any research project or any policy initiative. What do I mean by that? Well, let me begin with, just as an example, but it really is the primary point, let me begin with 4 different conceptions of the idea of equality. I would wager to say that for most of you that are at a conference like this, and for lawyers as well, you are deeply concerned with the question of equality. But what is equality, and how do we know it when we see it? Well, let me give you one idea of what equality is. The first idea you might think of as the notion of equal life chances. This is an intuitively clear notion to us that it is unfair, because we're talking about children here, that anybody should have anything less than an equal life chance as anybody else. Now, this seems to me to be a very robust notion of what equality is, but I would argue to you that there is virtually nothing in our policy agenda that takes seriously this kind of equality. It is just too robust for anything that we can colorably say tries to approximate it. Okay? We have a second idea of equality. Consider this the title, Narrowing the Achievement Gap. Okay, narrowing the achievement gap, we all know what that means, I think. And here, if I could maybe get a slide, see if, click. Okay, let me try to find the right slide here. I want to show you the NAEP scores. Click. There we go. All right, this is the familiar, I have 2 slides, one reading, one math, but it suffices to show you the math. This is what we're most familiar with in terms of what it means to narrow the achievement gap. You have a top line, which is white achievement over a 30-year period, and you have bottom 2 lines. Sorry, the Latino line is very faint. In yellow, blacks and Latinos trail whites in terms of student achievement by somewhere on the order of half to 3/4 of standard deviation. On the NAEP, that adds up to about 2 to 3, sometimes 4 grade levels. Okay? So presumably, narrowing the achievement gap would mean a kind of sandwiching of these lines, and you'd get, a sort of even line among all students. All right, that's one idea. But I submit to you that even that idea has buried within it a number of interesting complexities that one could tease out. Because, and this I will call the problem of averages. What you see in each of these dots is the aggregation, of course, of all the members of this specific group. And we might care a little bit about what the shape of the curve is, right? Each of the dots represents some sort of distribution. So this is a picture that is concerned only with where the means are between 2 distributions, and we want to sort of narrow that gap. But might we be concerned about, for example, whether the left tail of any distribution falls below some important threshold, a threshold of being able to function in the society such that no kid should be allowed to fall below that threshold. This is a picture that is not concerned with that issue. Think, for example, think also about the right tail of that distribution. There is some evidence to suggest that even if we were to narrow the achievement gap, right, to create overlapping curves in some way, the minority curve would be rather skinnier, and the white curve would be rather flatter and more spread out, which would mean that if you looked at the right tail of that distribution, what you'd see is primarily whites, if not exclusively whites, which has deep implications for things like affirmative action, access to elite higher education, access to the very highest rungs of the professions, and the like. None of that is captured by this particular version of equality that you can think of as sort of narrowing the achievement gap. Okay. Third conception of equality, I've already mentioned, which you can think of as kind of a, think of this as what we typically call today in litigation speak adequacy, but you might think of this as equal baselines. And there are two versions of this that I want to sort of flesh out. One is a version that is, you might think of it as skills-based. So there's a certain irreducible minimum of education that you think every kid should have. There's a certain kind of equality notion to that. And we have this idea that that baseline could be objective and that it is, in some sense, a bit static. Okay? I want to contrast that notion of adequacy with a fourth idea of equality, which I would call equal citizenship. Equal citizenship is not necessarily a skills-based notion. What I would say it is a status-based notion. Status-based meaning that it is the ideal state or the fair distribution is that which enables everyone to claim membership in the society in some way. If you'd like to think of it in these terms, you can say it is that degree of opportunity that enables everybody to claim to be middle class. And we know the middle class is very large. There are very rich people in the middle class, and there are some not so well-off people in the middle class. But the point is the identification with that status gives people a sense of membership and ownership in the society, and maybe that's what's really important. That is a conception that is dynamic based on the conditions of the society and informed by changes in the economy, in citizenship, in political situation over time, not the kind of static skills-based adequacy that you might associate with 1970s minimum competency tests. Okay? All right, so you have this, you have a broad menu of possible normative frameworks within which policy and educational research might be conducted. And the point I want to make is simply that it is striking to me sometimes when lawyers get together with the researchers, which we are wont to do in places that Chris walks, that there is a sort of conceptual disciplinary divide. Lawyers deal fundamentally in normative frameworks. The coin of the realm is the argument, right? We don't have a kind of a static, empirically neutral place to go to. All we have is a bunch of claims. All we do is talk. Right? Researchers, on the other hand, are, I think, naturally wary of adopting this kind of viewpoint-based approach to their work. In fact, what you're trying to do is to be objective. The coin of your realm is data. Right? You want to look at what the facts are on the ground. All I submit to you is that all empirical research occurs within some implicit normative framework that, whether you sort of realize it or not, is operating against the norms of whatever the policy environment, the legal environment happens to give you. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean by this. So I do a lot of work in the school finance area. And in school finance, it has long been sort of standard argument to talk about disparities in funding? Well, it just so happens that we've reached a point today where it's not very easy, really, to talk about disparities in funding along the typical criteria, race, socioeconomic class. Often you're going to find, in many central cities especially, that the disparities run the other way. Right? That in fact, urban schools, predominantly minority, are better funded than suburban white schools, not by much, but by a little. So one part of this is to ask, well, what's the use of that kind of finding? Seems not very interesting unless you had behind it some kind of normative idea that equal dollars was some important normative idea. But I would submit that equal dollars tells us very little about what kind of equality of opportunity kids are really getting. So the sort of next generation of the school finance research focused on weighting the pupils, right? Now, when you make that shift to say, okay, we're going to count each poor kid 1.2, we're going to count each disabled kid 1.9, whatever the numbers may be, you have shifted the whole conception of what it is that education is doing to one that suggests that education has important things to do with equal life chances, whatever those chances may have been conditioned by background, environment, and such. That's a far more ambitious agenda, and perhaps one that we'd all find more meaningful than the equal dollars conception, right? That's an important, and there's a ton of research still to do in that area, if that's something that appeals to you. For example, we have pupil weights for different characteristics, LEP, poverty, and such. We don't have pupil weights for things like poverty concentration, right? It's not just that kids are poor, but if you go to school with other poor kids, that's a double disadvantage. How do we count that? How do we count things like multiple overlapping disadvantage? If you are LEP and poor, is that additive, multiplicative, exponential, right? What's the relationship there? That's stuff we don't know. It seems to me you can't have a very interesting conversation about school finance disparities until you drill down onto some of those questions which illuminate what kinds of opportunities kids are really getting compared to one another. All right, that's one example. Another example you might think of as the debate, it's not really a debate, but a contrast between achievement and attainment, right? Pound for pound, my guess is more educational research has been devoted to the question of achievement than to the question of attainment. Now, a very important question is to ask, are we barking up the wrong tree? Not because the data, we prefer one set of data over another, but because normatively, maybe what we care more about is attainment. Because attainment is what gives people, for example, graduating from high school, is what gives people membership in the society, right? It gives people the status that if you subscribe to my fourth view, equal citizenship, you might be more concerned about than relative differences in test scores, which are very hard to correlate with life outcomes and life chances, right? So here, too, we might want to rethink, based on the normative background framework, which ought to be the primary focus of our educational research. Finally, and this is my sort of all-time favorite, when we think about proficiency, adequacy, or whatnot, we've been given this No Child Left Behind framework. Now, we will increasingly see, I think, a set of studies come out about achievement gaps based on No Child Left Behind proficiency, resource sufficiency based on No Child Left Behind proficiency. And the more and more we indulge that research, it seems to me, we are keeping implicit or unspoken an important part of the No Child Left Behind framework, which is that it is primarily a state-driven process. Right? I do have some slides on this, if I could click. Great. Not. Here is some interesting data for you. Let's see if I can get the previous slide. Okay. Okay. This is a comparison of NAEP scores by fourth graders on math on state tests versus, between NAEP scores and state tests. Both types of tests have this label proficient attached to them, okay? So follow me here. The vertical axis is the percentage of kids who are proficient on the state tests, and the horizontal axis is the percentage proficient on the national test. And each of these states has a little dot, right? So you see that, for example, I can't read it so well, but I think that's Mississippi and Alabama over there in the top left, claiming that 75% of their kids are proficient on the state test, but in fact, only 17 or 18% are proficient on the national test, right? And you have a whole, so you see, based on this kind of schematic, that states are literally all over the map in terms of their achievement, in terms of their standards. These lines, just to guide your sight here, you see a vertical line. That is the average percentage proficient in the whole nation, right? So it's about 31% on math. So you see some states to the right, some states to the left, and quite a distribution. The bottom slope is the line where the states would line up if their standards matched the NAEP standard, 1-to-1. So the same percent would be proficient on each test. Very few states match up. And then the top sloping line is the best fit line among all the dots. You can think of it as the average standards in the whole country, what actually exists, okay? Now, this, it seems to me, this picture has something to do with, that's reading, same thing. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. With this picture, okay? When we talk about opportunity disparities, right, it seems to me that if we indulge the No Child Left Behind model, we miss this picture. Each of these bars represents the level of funding from the 10th percentile, meaning lowest, low percentile funded district in a state, to the 50th percentile, the median district in the state. And what this shows you is that in 14 states, the lowest funded districts, the 10th percentile districts, outspend the median districts in 14 other states. In fact, you can see similar data for the 50th to the 90th. So these 10 or 11 states at the top here, their median district outspends the 90th percentile district, highest spending districts, in the bottom 10 or 11 states. Here, last slide, is the most extreme, where the lowest spending districts in places like New Jersey, New York, Connecticut outspend the 90th percentile district in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. We have two educational nations based on this kind of graphic. And as Chris said, it sort of makes you wonder. I thought we had a civil war. And I seem to recall the same side won as you did, right? So the discourse on No Child Left Behind, it seems to me, if you operate within that paradigm, leaves implicit these grave, serious inequalities that can only be gotten, I think, with important qualifiers to research, as well as new research agendas that seek to examine this type of inequality at this much broader scale. Okay, so just to conclude, my central conclusion point ends up right where Chris ended up, which is that we will only be able to get at the most difficult policy choices, not based on what technology or what research we have available to us, but about what values we fundamentally care about. What is a fair and just society? And it's at this important normative level that both researchers and policymakers will have to engage. And it's at this level that the new civil rights agenda will be either won or lost. Thank you very much.
Hi. I have a question for either one or both of you. We're here in California, and in 2 months, we're getting ready to see whether achievement or attainment is going to drive the high school graduating class of 2006. The CASE, our high school exit exam, is marked by the same kind of achievement gaps that we see in most other standardized testing. Most educators have been pretty silent on it, I think, because no one wants to argue against a standard of competence for a high school diploma. The question is, however, where are we going to come down when, in fact, not granting high school diplomas to kids who don't pass this test is going to result in some of those districts with the highest percentages of Latino and African American students granting very, very few high school diplomas this spring?
I was trying to get Goodwin to answer it because it's hard. I have a very strong view about this testing, which is that it even putting aside questions of whether or not the assessment instrument itself is well designed. I am just fundamentally opposed to having high-stakes testing for kids using these kinds of instruments. I think it is so I'm for accountability, and an accountability system has to have assessments in it, but they've got to be the right kind of assessments, and they ought to follow the joint standards. And I'm for finding out whether my kids are doing well or not, but I'm for using multiple measures to figure that out. And I'm certainly not for building an accountability system that makes the sharp point of the accountability spear, where you're sticking it to the most vulnerable, least powerful folks in the system, namely the kids. So as a civil rights matter, as a scientific matter, I think that having these kinds of high stakes exams for diploma denial or for retention is wrong, and frankly I think it's illegal and under Title VI. So now, having said that, let me hurry on to say that where we need help, that is to say where I think people interested in civil rights need help, we need to be able to go to Congress or go to state legislatures and say, this is the kind of accountability and assessment system we want, that we think, informed by the science, will advance racial and ethnic justice. And that gets back to my point both about the alliances and about the intellectual capital. I mean, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is the coalition mechanism in Washington for advancing these claims in the context, in any context, but I mean, it's that group, that coalition group, that will be responsible for figuring out what the civil rights position is for amending No Child Left Behind. That group needs to figure out whether it's for growth models in AYP, needs to figure out what do we mean by multiple measures, if it's distinct from multiple administrations, needs to figure out if we think portfolio is a great idea, how do you do it? And without intellectual capital, they simply won't be able to participate effectively in that discussion. So I think that we can't just fight Casey because we're against testing and accountability. I think we should fight Casey, but at the same time, I think we need to say, and here's the alternative mechanism in which we would have confidence, because otherwise, I can tell you, you just get pushed out of the discussion and attacked for not caring about standards, attacked for continuing the tyranny of low expectations, ...
I was wondering if you're aware of institutions or ways that we can have more civil rights lawyers available and collaborating. I come from North Carolina, which is resegregating, and you have lawyers that are paid $300,000, $400,000 to defend school districts that are resegregating, and the lone civil rights lawyer working for a nonprofit without a secretary making, less than $60,000, juggling hundreds of cases, trying to help families and researchers and people who are calling night and day. It seems to me that we don't have the manpower or the organization or the networks that we have some years ago to try to end segregation in now fighting the turning back.
You said you're from North Carolina?
Yes.
Right. So
I'm familiar with the Civil Rights Project
Right.
at UNC.
I was just going to say, talk to me.
And that's what prompts me to
Right.
ask that, because I went to a meeting with one of their lawyers who is worried about stopping for lunch, answering the phone, working with student interns. And I know, working for a district, that all my superintendent has to do to counteract her organizational skills is call this very important, well-connected law firm with a slew of lawyers who are going to prove that our redistricting system is against, legally sound. It's a battle. It's David and Goliath, the way I look at it.
Look, let me say a couple of things. One is this has always been the problem in civil rights advocacy. So it is by no means a new development. In fact, you could argue the situation is better today than it used to be, in that there's certainly more Black and Latino lawyers today than there were a generation ago, but there are also many more law firms that are willing to do pro bono work than there were a generation ago. But I'd say two things. One is it's important to set priorities. If there are 50 different controversies that could be tackled in a particular state, it's important for the education community, the advocacy community, to identify the highest priority ones and then find help tackling those, so that you don't have so the limited resource that you have isn't too dissipated. That's point number one. Point number two is I want to incorporate by reference everything that Goodwin said about looking outside the litigation forum. It's not just about figuring out a way to go to court. It's also about figuring out a way to go to the state legislature and figuring out a way to go to school boards. It's all of the various forms in which advocacy can be helpful. And it may be that you leverage legal expertise in some of these other forums, because it doesn't have to be a lawyer doing the lobbying, obviously. You can have a lawyer to help you in terms of drafting the statutory changes, et cetera, advising you about the strategy, but then in terms of troops to actually pound on doors and organize the phone banks, et cetera, that doesn't require lawyers. So you can in part you can deal with the resource constraint in the litigation arena by shifting arenas for the advocacy, and as Goodwin suggests, you may be better off in another arena anyway. So I'd say those two things: priority setting and shifting arenas. Yes.
Thank you both for coming and addressing us. My question takes us back to the legal arena. I would like you both of you to take a shot at addressing what is the likelihood that in the next few years the Supreme Court will hear a case about the constitutionality of diversity in K-12, and what can we as social scientists and educational researchers do to help you prepare for this case?
Great question. So the issue is, of course, that the 2003 Michigan Affirmative Action case says that diversity is a compelling interest in the higher education arena, but did not speak to the K-12 arena. And you have out there a number of programs that you can think of them as voluntary integration programs, meaning nobody's telling the districts to do it. They're doing it out of their own enlightened policy. Thus far, there have been 3 major litigations over this issue, major ones. I mean, there are minor cases, too. 2 of the courts, the First Circuit, who sits in Boston, and then the Ninth Circuit, in a case out of Seattle, reached the same conclusion, which is that diversity, educational diversity, is, if not equally and perhaps more of an imperative in the K-12 arena than it is in higher education. After all, the whole point about why educational diversity is important in higher education is because the kids didn't get enough of it in K-12 education. So it would seem odd if the Supreme Court, if it were to ever hear a case, and I'll get to that in a second, if the Supreme Court were to conclude something different about the fundamental value of educational diversity at the K-12 level versus higher ed. As with all things, though, the devil is in the details. And so how districts go about designing their voluntary integration programs, whether they are voluntary to the participants, whether they involve busing, how much weight is given to race, all of those aspects are evaluated according to very ill-defined standards in the courts. But the fortunate thing is that the First Circuit, in a opinion dealing with a school district called Lynn, which is a very small school district about 10 miles northeast of Boston, found that the voluntary integration plan there was okay, and that operated within a small geographic area in which perhaps not a whole lot of movement was necessary in order to get fairly integrated schools. In some ways, the more important case was the case out of Seattle, which is a large school district covering a very expansive geographic area with sort of, the basic geography is better schools in the north and less good schools in the south, and there was this sort of up and down mixing going on. And the court, and both of these cases, by the way, were decided not only by typical 3-judge panels in the federal courts, but they were heard by the full Court of Appeals, so they have sort of this extra weight that's given to them. The court there found that in Seattle, too, the mechanisms used were sufficiently well tailored to the important, compelling interest asserted there. The third case is one in Louisville, which is still being litigated. But as these cases go forward, my hope is that this will never even reach the Supreme Court, because the courts of appeals will basically be in agreement about these issues. And typically, the Supreme Court doesn't step into cases when it doesn't need to. And typically, the most pressing need for the Supreme Court to step into a case is when there's disagreement about an issue of federal law in various parts of the country. But so far, we have unanimity. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, a pretty good thing.
The only thing I would add is that I think that the basic intellectual structure of the questions we need to pursue fairly well tracks what we developed in connection with the Michigan cases. You can sort of think of it deductively from the question of, well, what are the benefits? What are the benefits to individual students? What are the benefits to the institution? What are the benefits for society that would come about by having more integration? How are educational outcomes different? And trying to figure out ways to document those. But I share Goodwin's view completely that I don't feel hugely at risk from the Supreme Court with respect to K-12. I hope I don't have to eat those words. Do we have time for one more? Last question. Yes.
Actually, this is more a practice kind of internal to the academy and to academics. Question is really more legal, where the Supreme Court gave us as higher education the latitude to make sound educational decisions as it relates to admissions. I'm curious from the standpoint of both of you as being professors, how in many ways the reasons we have to go to court is because our own colleagues implement educational policies and practices that counter our civil rights goals, which is equity and access. So when we continue to implement standardized tests and utilize SATs, LSATs that are completely misaligned with educational outcomes, I'm wondering what suggestions you have from a political standpoint of how we take this on internally when our own colleagues don't hire faculty of color, when our own colleagues keep voting for the use of SATs and LSATs. How would you suggest we take that on, that challenge on from a practice standpoint, policy standpoint? Because I agree with the legislative localized standpoint that you mentioned, Gordon.
Chris is a dean, so this is really Chris's question. But I'll offer just a couple observations from Bolt. I think we are very fortunate to have people like Chris and Chancellor Bourgeois at Berkeley who have made it a priority, and I cannot think of any answer to your question that doesn't involve the issue of leadership. It is absolutely essential that the people at the highest rungs of any institution be deeply committed, lest, not simply for the fairness reasons involved, but even if you were instrumental about it, as the questioner suggests, to insulate yourself from litigation or the risk of litigation based on the idea that you're only doing what's expedient and only thus far and no further, instead of truly valuing whether it's educational diversity or something else, and incorporating it as a fundamental value throughout all that you do in the institution. It seems to me that on both educational and legal expedient grounds, that is the better path to tread. Just one small note for those of you who may be interested. There is a member of our faculty, Marge Schultz, who is looking at some interesting questions related to what predictors, what might be better predictors than the typical numerical ones of what makes a good lawyer, an effective lawyer. This is going to be a hard, you say, what do you say to your colleagues? It's going to be a hard case to make because law schools are guiltier perhaps than any other type of school in following the numbers to their sort of, rank ordering logical conclusion. But nonetheless, it's an important area of research that is kind of, I think, getting off the ground. I think Marge, along with her collaborator, Shelley Zedek, are going to make an important contribution to the burgeoning literature on what might be better predictors of the qualities we really care about in our future graduates rather than simply testing.
The only thing I'd add to what Goodwin said is that it's fairly straightforward to conceptualize this campus struggle as a political one. Fine. But it can also be characterized as an intellectual struggle. And I sort of harbor a sense that to the extent people can be invited to treat this as an intellectual matter and therefore commit to studying literature, engaging in institutional research, etc., that some people who are undecided or weakly committed can be brought to the cause. Look, there's stuff in the footnotes that the Supreme Court cited in the Michigan cases that I guarantee you most folks on campuses who do not favor affirmative action haven't thought about in a sophisticated way. So if there is some way to, in a way, challenge the critics by getting them to act like intellectuals and engage with you in a discussion about the merits, then it may be that at least for some folks that is a useful strategy, not in place of, but to complement whatever the political strategy is. Why don't we stop there, and thank you again.
Thank you both to Dean Edley and Professor Liu, and thank you for coming.